Hey everybody, welcome to Oshkosh. I guess we all finally made it here, right? Who flew in? Okay, awesome. Who flew in more than 1,000 miles to get here? What about 1,500 miles?
Does that include the whole?
Well, okay, yeah, well, but let's not include the whole. Let's go geographic miles, okay? Anybody from another foreign country that flew in here? Okay, not... Oh, last year, true. So there's a variety of experience. All these people, we come from all over the country, some people from all over the world to fly into this giant event. It's absolutely one of my favorites. I've been presenting here with the FAST team at Oshkosh for about 4 or 5 years now, and I'm also an international ferry pilot, as you can see. The pictures kind of tell a little bit of a different story. I mean, how often do you see a true airspeed of 156 knots at 21,000 feet? Not quite often. We have a few ferry pilots in here who have seen those kind of speeds, but not exactly the most typical thing that people do. In fact, I talk to airliners and jet pilots all the time on my way over, and they can't believe that I'm ferrying a single-engine plane across the ocean. But it can be done safely, and that's kind of what I'm talking about. Performance planning and decision-making, a lot of different things that ferrying has taught me in order to be a safer pilot and to be able to do these extraordinary trips. In fact, just before I came here, I flew a Super Cub all the way from the Detroit area to Alaska. It took nearly 40 hours of flying, with the ground speeds ranging anywhere from 65 to 70 knots. I've taken air tractors, VFR-only airplanes, across bodies of water as well. So these things can be done, and they can be done safely. And so people don't realize that, hey, just because I fly a 152 doesn't mean I can't take it all over the world. Well, you can. There's a lot of different techniques that we can talk about that can help you do that. This is one of my absolutely favorite quotes. When people ask me, why do I do what I do, most of the time they just assume I'm crazy. They assume that I'm one of those wild people that just gets a thrill out of flying a single-engine plane across the ocean. But one of my favorite quotes by Charles Lindbergh, I began to feel that I lived on a higher plane than the skeptics of the ground, one that was richer because of its very association with the element of danger they dreaded, because it was freer of the earth to which they were bound. In flying, I tasted a wine of the gods, of which they could know nothing. Who valued life more highly, the aviators who spent it on the art they loved, or these misers who doled it out like pennies through their ant-like days? I decided that if I could fly for 10 years before I was killed in a crash, it would be a worthwhile trade for an ordinary lifetime. And I think a lot of us who love aviation feel the exact same way, that sometimes the things that we do are worth the mitigated risks that we take. And that's exactly what this is about. And this picture I took off the east coast of Greenland when I was taking a 210 across. Beautiful day. You don't really get a lot of clear days like that on the east coast of Greenland. A little bit about me. I'm a current captain at SkyWest. I'm also a CTP simulator instructor. I am the owner and an oceanic ferry pilot for FullThrottle Aviation. I've now raised the number to 117 different types of aircraft because I did fly a few new ones the other day in 15 different countries. I'm a FAST team lead representative for the Houston FSDO. So I've been doing a lot of safety seminars and work with air traffic controllers there. I'm a NAFI Master Instructor, and there's my Super Cub from 2 years ago, the last time I flew it up into Oshkosh. I won the smallest tent award, as you can see. In fact, I was joking because the very first time I flew into Oshkosh, I hadn't tried out my tent and my mattress, and I bought one of those mattresses that sits, a foot off the ground. Well, it doesn't fit in the tent. And so my very first time camping, I actually put the mattress underneath the tent and strapped the tent on top of it. And that's how I was, first time camping here. So what I'm going to talk about is I'm going to talk about a few of my more interesting crossings and kind of what I use to mitigate some of that risk, as well as VFR airplanes over bodies of water, international operations, aircraft limitations, advanced weather, and one of my favorite terms, personal forecasts, as well as some references to how I got all this data. So I'll start out with a little bit of background. So I got called to take a Turbo 210 across. It actually was still a Turbo 210, but it had a STC for an IO 550, which was a little bit different than the standard engine that the Turbo 210s had. So it was normally aspirated. And this airplane actually had a background to it. It was its nickname was Baloo, and it did an around-the-world flight, actually, a few years ago. And so it was already kind of a famous airplane going across, had amazing performance. And I got this call that it needed to go overseas, and I said, well, I guess I'm up for the challenge. And so it was February, which definitely changes things quite a bit. February is generally the coldest month in the Arctic. So we start with preparation. As you can see, I didn't really pack too light. And I shipped a bunch of equipment. Usually that's how it starts. You get all the equipment that you need. You figure out what you need for the airplane. Does it have supplemental oxygen? Do you need rafts? Does it have a survival kit? Because it's like you're flying the same plane every time. You've got to figure out exactly what you need. So you start out with getting your gear. Somebody always asks me, well, how do you know what you need? And I said the best way to find out exactly what you need on anything, whether or not you're trying to camp out in the woods or trying to test your survival kit, is to go out there and try it for 3 days and figure out what you're missing. Figure out real quick exactly what you need and what you left behind. But over time, I've kind of developed a system and figured out exactly what I'm going to need, and I kind of plan for that. Some airplanes, we need engine blankets to be able to cover over the top for a preheat. Or, you need special tools. For example, if I'm doing an oil change along the way, I bring the tools to cut the filter and do a proper oil change, as well as all the right fittings and everything for that particular engine, whether or not it has a quick drain. Especially when you're dealing with STCs, you never know what you're going to get. Some of the newer Cessnas don't have quick drains, so a lot of it is trying to figure out what you need. So usually you start with a list, and when we get to the airplane, we usually make a Walmart or an AutoZone run and get the rest of the equipment that you need. So I usually ship everything ahead of time that I think I need, and then I probably end up spending about another $200 getting all the stuff that I didn't have. So some of the other gear that we need, as you can see, we actually didn't have very good range in this plane. So a Turbo 206, if you look on the website, the brand new Turbo 206s, they advertise 703 nautical miles of range. But they get that data in a variety of different ways with your optimum conditions, because your range will actually depend on your ISA deviation, which is going to vary from year to year if you ever look at the performance charts, even in a Turbo 206. And so at the perfect conditions, at these exact ISA conditions, at exactly this altitude, you get that range. But in all reality, 703 miles, I wouldn't bank on that in this type of airplane. So we had to plan for a stop at some of our less known airports that will serve you avgas, but only in a barrel. In fact, avgas is fairly difficult to find when you start getting really far north or even outside of the United States. Europe is usually not really a problem, but in northern Canada and in parts of Greenland, Iceland, avgas can be a little bit hard to come by. So a lot of times they'll have it available, but only in a drum, and you're going to have to bring your own pump and pump it yourself into the wings. And so you can see me down there at, this was in Sault Ste. Marie, scraping the thin layer of ice that we had got on the airplane, which we'll talk about icing in a little bit. The earlier 210s were actually certified for flight into known icing conditions, but later the FAA came out with guidance saying that the they would not meet the standards of the new requirements, but yet the old ones were still FEAky. So you can see me scraping a thin layer of ice off of that airplane. So this is kind of a funny video I put together for when we were actually fueling up in this little airport called Coujouac, which is on it's not the northernmost point of Quebec, but it's right before you go over about 80 miles of water over to Baffin Island, which is up in the Arctic Circle. And so I have a video here of us fueling the airplane with a little bit of advice for your pump selection. You can play the video. So we're on our way to Germany in this beautiful 206. And we're up at Coujouac. Probably didn't say that right. You had to bring your own pump. So here we are pumping. At this time I'm observing, I'm taking my break because I started on the pumping and now Dwayne's finishing it here. This is kind of the setup we got. Note to self, don't buy the cheapest pump on Amazon because they leak. It leaks quite a bit. So maybe a one-time use kind of thing. But we'll be on our way to Iqaluit shortly. Pretty good weather considering it's this time of year. So see you on the other side. As you can see, there's no ladder around there. A lot of these places that you go to, I mean, you have to be completely self-sufficient. They won't have a ladder. They won't have any tools available for you. So what I did is I jumped onto the top of the barrel, stuck the hose in, and then jumped down to finish the pumping process. Now, there was a few screws we were able to tighten a little bit on the pump to help the leaking, but, we did. It was only like a $30 pump plus $10 shipping, so. So how do you know what you need to do? How do you know that the plane is in good condition? That's probably one of the most often asked questions that I received. People always ask me, how do you know if the plane is safe? How many of you guys have ever jumped into a plane you've never flown before? Who's ever done a test flight before taking an airplane a long distance they haven't flown before? That's probably a good idea. You don't know what you don't know. You never know how other people maintain their airplanes. Who here owns their own airplane? And who here mostly rents? I rented for a very long time, and I always like to compare it to what Forrest Gump said. Life is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. So you never quite know the condition of the airplane, so a lot of times a proper pre-flight and a logbook inspection is pretty much all you can do to determine its airworthiness. Now, of course, the PIC is ultimately responsible, but there are things we can do to ensure we don't break down along the way. Now, if you're here flying around Wisconsin or Texas or Georgia, chances are if you break down, you might be able to get somebody to come out and look at it, maybe somebody to come help you out. But when you're up north, it's far and few between for people who can actually work on piston airplanes. And so you got to make sure you get all your squawks out before you go. So normally that involves a test flight. And what I personally do, and what I would recommend other people do, is develop your own checklist. So you can kind of test everything to see if it works, right? Because, the pre-flight inspection checklist that usually comes with the airplane only includes external and cosmetic items. But if you really want to know how the plane works, you need to go up there, practice all the different things you want to do. Do a LENA peak check, do a TIT check if you're flying a turbocharged airplane. Go up there, shoot an ILS, shoot an RNAV. Work with the GPS, put everything to its max, do several gear extensions, all these different things, because you want to know that it's working before you go, because you don't know what you're going to get to. So you definitely want to find the squawks. Who here uses a test flight checklist when they do that? So some of our more advanced, I know, Brian does. He's another ferry pilot. So yeah, so a lot of the more professional people, they use that. A lot of times they also call it an acceptance flight. So if you ever pick up an aircraft brand new at the factory, has anybody ever done that before? I wish, not my own, but, if you've ever picked up an aircraft at the factory, they usually do an acceptance flight. And so, a Cessna or Cirrus will sit there and they'll check off all the items and make sure that they're working, in working condition. And a lot of times, if you call your aircraft manufacturer, they will provide a checklist of that sort if you want it. That way you could do your own acceptance flight, especially because there's a lot of people who buy airplanes who aren't as knowledgeable about that particular airplane. They can have somebody who's a professional, like a ferry pilot or a local CFI, check some things out for them, because the pre-buy usually goes beyond just the logbooks and an external pre-flight inspection. So this is one of my favorite things that I like, and this was actually my, my performance log from the Cessna 210. And you can see that I wrote it down originally in a little book, but then I created a performance chart out of that. And why do you think that is? Because every plane flies differently. How many times have you been told by somebody, hey, my airplane does 170 knots at 10 gallons an hour, and it didn't do it? All the time. Oh, yeah, this is the best flying Mooney in the world. It'll do 200 knots at 10,000 feet and only burns 3 gallons an hour. I'm sure there's somebody trying to sell a plane out here saying something like that, right? So what is the plane actually going to do? The POH is really close. I've usually found that they're pretty close to the POH, but when you start talking about STCs for engines, different mods for these airplanes, because a lot of the older ones have a lot of supplemental type certificates. I think there was a FAA bulletin that came out not too long ago. They called it Frankenplane, because it was an airplane that had 100 different STCs on it, and nobody even knew what it did anymore. So whenever you're dealing with a different airplane, it's always good to keep a performance log, so you can find out exactly what the airplane is doing. Now, the airplane's going to do something different based on your flying style. So usually, I also write down my flying style. Like, do I go full power all the way up to 15,000 feet before leaning, or do I have a fuel pump on? All those things play into your exact performance. But keeping a performance log will give you a really good idea of what that airplane's going to do. And you can establish a trend. And so if I'm going along and I'm burning, if I'm only burning about 14 or 12 to 13 gallons per hour, and then all of a sudden I do one leg and I'm burning 9, or one leg I'm burning 18, well, that might be a sign that something is developing. So it's really good to keep a performance log for your airplane in order to figure out exactly what it's going to do in order to get reliable data before you go over the water.
Why were you on the ground for 3 weeks?
I'll talk about that. It is weather related. There's a lot of weather issues in the North Atlantic in February, so I'll talk about that. And this is kind of one of my other en route logs. I like to write stuff down. So about every 20, 30 minutes, I usually write something down, even if everything's going smooth. In this case, I wrote clear skies as well as ship locations, coordinates, their positions, what direction they were headed, several large ships and oil rigs. I kind of write all those different things down. That way, if you do have an issue and you see something coming, you can probably start heading toward one of those. And I use some other tools as well for that. And I just kind of keep track of everything as it's going along, what the engine's doing. This was not from the Cessna 210. I couldn't find that book. But this was from Air Tractor, and I figured out where each of my fuel lines were. If it was down to the bars in the airplane, that means I had 30 gallons left. And if there's a line on the screen, then I knew I had 200 gallons left, and so on and so on. So it would tell me exactly how much fuel I had left if you're using visual calculations only. So different tools that I use. I was talking about writing down ship locations, and I'm going to talk about when I talk about rescue services, which is something that I believe a Coast Guard instructor talked about earlier today. But generally speaking, if you're more than 150 miles from shore, and not just from shore, but from somewhere that has a base for rescue helicopters, there's a really good chance they're not going to be able to come out and get you. Now, there's a few places they can go up 250 miles in the helicopters, but for the most part, in a lot of these areas, you're going to be stuck using marine traffic or boat in order to come rescue you. So knowing these locations is good as well, and we'll talk about survival suits, exposure times, and everything like that. But obviously, you want to try to limit the amount of time that you're in the water, and knowledge is absolute power when it comes to that, because these boats are moving along at 5 knots, maybe some of the faster ones, these freighters. And so if you can get another 10 miles closer to them, that's a lot less time in the water. And so knowing their location is kind of good too, knowing shipping routes and everything like that, as well as currents, so you can kind of judge how you can be if you absolutely had an emergency. So I usually keep screenshots of that with me, and you can't really see them very well, but these were some of the ships that I took pictures of on one of my last crossings. So who here has flown internationally? Has anybody flown to Europe? Okay. What about Central America? Okay, South America? What about Africa? Okay. What about Asia? Anybody's here flown to Asia? Okay. So everybody has different rules. Now we have ICAO, which is supposed to standardize everything, but do they really? We have two places in the world that always like to speak foreign languages on the frequency that at least I've experienced personally. One of them is in France, in parts of Quebec and Montreal. They like to speak French. And then down in Central and South America, they speak almost all Spanish on the frequency. Now, if you reply in English, they will start speaking English, but for the most part, your situational awareness is reduced. And so different countries have different rules. Not everybody has the same rules as the United States. And so that's why it's really, really important that if you're flying in these foreign countries that you understand their rules. Canada has very different requirements than, let's say, Mexico. Mexico recently implemented a rule where you actually have to have a 406 ELT in order to be legal. And so all these different countries have all these different rules. So before you go, you need to make sure that you're in compliance with that individual country. In fact, there are some countries out there, I don't know if you've seen the news, where people have actually been jailed for not having the right equipment in their airplanes. So not everything is like here, getting a slap on the wrist. I always make the joke that the FAA is a teddy bear compared to some of these other countries. The other countries, they don't have any tolerance for anything. If they catch you without the right equipment or not the right piece of paper in the airplane, it's a much different penalty than you would here in the U.S. So making sure that you know your foreign procedures is really important, as well as oceanic procedures. Who here has ever crossed oceans? Okay. Who here has done all their own handling on their international flying? Okay, there's a few of you guys there. So you guys are familiar with the process, so you can use handlers to kind of help you. There's a bunch of different resources out there, which I'll talk about, like the Baja Bush pilots. They do a lot with Central and South America. If you want to learn oceanic procedures, there's a bunch of training materials out there. Or maybe just talk to somebody who's done it before. Maybe have them go along with you. That's actually been a really big part of our business, was been accompanying owners who buy airplanes in Europe, and they want to get the experience too and learn, and so we go with them on that. And here I am with the famous Drew over at Wick, Scotland. It used to be owned by another guy named Andrew, and they're kind of a really well-known launch point for ferry flights, both eastbound and westbound, up there on the northeast side of Scotland. So here I am in an air tractor about to take it over the ocean. As you can see, I've got my little life vest on, and I've got warm clothes on, and that's because even in the summertime, an air tractor only has air conditioning. Now, most of us would probably not find a problem with that, right? Who wouldn't mind having an airplane that only had air conditioning? We can all feel that, right? And I don't even like the way the air conditioning is mounted, because it's mounted right between your legs, and that really doesn't do me a whole lot of good. So it's got air conditioning, but it's got no heat. And so even though it might be 100 degrees on the ground, what's your temperature up at 15,000 feet? What's your temperature up at 10,000 feet? It could be very, very dramatically different, especially during certain times of the year. We don't always have a standard lapse rate, right? You could have frontal systems, you could have different weather. Always check your temperatures, because nothing's worse than being cold in an airplane. I would almost rather be hot and sweaty than be cold in an airplane. So I actually had the gear that time going across. In this airplane, it was full of hopper fuel. So a lot of the air tractors and the ag planes, they have the ability where you can actually, instead of putting chemical in the hopper, you can put a bunch of fuel in there, and then you can feed that straight to the engine. And this one actually had a Walters turbine on it, so it was feeding out of the hopper. And so here's a video of me. This is my makeshift autopilot. I flew this plane northbound. It ended up being about 8 hours flying in this airplane without stopping. And I had about 11 hours of gas. So I was landing with a 3-hour reserve over the water. I went straight from Belize up to Houston. And I had to do something to try to help with the air tractor. Who here has flown an air tractor before? The air tractor pilots? People always make the joke, they're the most unstable airplanes. Every once in a while, you'll see a video on YouTube of somebody who lets their hands off the stick and the plane actually flies straight. But for the most part, most of them aren't like that. And so this one, I developed my own autopilot, which you guys will see, which is actually very helpful in trying to keep the airplane straight and minimize pilot fatigue while over the water. So there I am with my air tractor autopilot. As you can see, it was a cheap bungee cord I got at the store. And it did the job quite nicely. It was almost sad when I had to take it off for landing. It made it so smooth and stable. I still had to hold my feet on the rudders and my hand on the stick, but it minimized a whole lot of this motion, right? Who here flies long distances without an autopilot in their plane? Okay, so you guys are kind of used to it. You know, but we're talking about, this was an 8-hour flight. Well, it was only supposed to be 7, but they made me hold because I was an air tractor trying to go into the international airport, and they wanted Southwest to go first. So I ended up having to hold for a better part of 45, 50 minutes before I could get in. So, but yeah, so you guys are probably used to it then, right? Who has an autopilot in their airplane? That's nice, right? An autopilot's a great tool. It can minimize your workload. You don't have to sit there and hold the controls for that long. You don't feel nearly as tired after you're done. And I mean, it really does make a huge difference. So that's my air tractor autopilot. There's another picture of it. You can see the bungees are attached to the panel. And that's the instrumentation I had the entire way across. There's not an attitude indicator in there. I've got an inclinometer and pretty much engine instruments. Now, an air tractor is a restricted category airplane. And so it doesn't have to meet the same airworthiness requirements as, let's say, a standard airworthiness certificate or an experimental airworthiness certificate. And so it's a restricted category meant for literally crop dusting. And so it lacks a lot of the basic instrumentation, which comes to my next slide. Tools for survival. How many of you guys fly non-instrument equipped airplanes? Okay, so there's a few of you. Who does not have an attitude indicator in their plane? I'm going to put 2 hands up because one in the air tractor and my Cub doesn't have one either. And so obviously there's a lot of different tools out there that people can use for artificial horizons, but I find this to be especially valuable. Now, as far as regulatory is concerned, if you have VFR weather, you fly VFR flight rules. But has anybody ever been over the water and not being able to see a really good horizon before? All the time, right? There might not be a single cloud in the sky, and you can see from the picture, you got a little bit of clouds up there, but on a crystal clear day, depending on the haze level, the visibility might be 10 miles. The clouds might be completely clear, but you might not be able to tell right side up from upside down. And so one thing that I always take with me in airplanes that do not have an attitude indicator is a backup one. And so in this case, I had my Dynon D1 out. I didn't have it on at the time because I still had visual reference. But there's a lot of times where you're not going to have visual reference, even though the weather might be completely clear. And so if you're going to be taking an airplane over water and you're not instrument equipped, I would highly recommend using some type of device that can give you backup instrumentation. And this is another big thing that I harp on. Who here flies any distance over water? Maybe the Great Lakes, Gulf of Mexico, Anything like that? Maybe even, a local lake, Lake Tahoe or anything like that. Who here always makes sure they have a raft and a vest whenever they're going over these waters? And I've been guilty of it too. I've cut corners before, and I'm like, oh, I'm only, I'm probably about a mile short of gliding distance from shore, and you don't think much of it. But people don't realize what exactly it takes if you end up even 2 miles off the shore. There was an instance of a guy who I believe he ditched I don't remember the type of aircraft, I know it was a small piston single, off the coast of one of Hawaii's islands. On a flight plan, PLB, everything. And he was less than 10 miles away from shore, and it took them nearly 2 days to rescue him. That was 10 miles from shore. Think about when your search area is hundreds of miles long, right? If you don't even have the basic equipment to keep yourself alive, then you're going to be in a bad situation if that moment does ever come. And I make it a point, I will not fly, I don't care what it is, unless I have the equipment to survive. And there's different tables that you can look at that show like the water temperature versus, your exposure time and everything like that. But I will not even go without a gliding distance of land. That is making sure, unless I know for sure that I have the equipment. Because just because you're a mile offshore doesn't mean you're going to be rescued right away. And trying to swim that kind of distance is quite the task. So I always say, anytime you're outside a gliding distance of land, at least have a raft and at least have a life vest, a personal flotation device. And of course an exposure suit. People always laugh at me because I'll sit there in Milwaukee, right? In Milwaukee, and that's usually my launch point because I do a lot of the paperwork with customs for the airplanes going out of Milwaukee. And I go up to Sault Ste. Marie, which is one of my favorite fuel stops on the way up through Canada. And people laugh at me because I'm sitting there in the hangar in Milwaukee and I'm putting on the suit and they're like, what ocean are you going over? I was like, Lake Michigan. I'm going over Lake Michigan. A lot of times in the winter or even the spring, that water temperature is still pretty cold. So I'm going to have my suit and I'm going to have my raft and everything available to me because who knows, it could be a day for them to get you, right? So let's talk about aircraft limitations. Because a lot of people have different types of airplanes. And for me, I know personally, I fly so many different airplanes, it's hard for me to remember every single one of them. But before each ferry flight, I read pretty much the entire POH from start to finish. I get an intimate understanding of those systems as well as the limitations of those airplanes. A lot of these piston singles are really not meant for the extreme cold temperatures of the Arctic or even some of the extreme hot temperatures. Who here has a hot temperature limitation in their airplane? Even at the airlines, we have hot temperature limitations. You ever been in Phoenix and they delayed your flight because it got too hot out? Or maybe it's one of these other hotter cities, maybe Las Vegas, they delayed your flight because it got too hot out. Who's ever been delayed because it got too cold? I've had issues where, APUs won't start in the jet or even engines won't start when it's extremely cold out. And so a lot of airplanes actually have limitations against that. So make sure that you're operating those airplanes within those limitations because that's what they were certified for. That's what the test flights were. You go beyond those, you're your own test pilot. Understand the inner working of their systems. How many of you guys know a pilot that couldn't tell you how their attitude indicator worked? Okay. How many pilots couldn't even tell you how a piston engine works or what a piston was? There's still a few of those out there, right? So we have people that don't always have a good working knowledge of that. The reason that I say this is important is because a lot of these different airplanes, especially some of these experimentals or even these larger aircraft, like for example an Aero Commander, they've got very different systems than anything else. Who's flown a really oddball airplane that just did everything wrong? Just really, really weird. Yeah, exactly. So all these different airplanes, they have different systems, and understanding those is key because if something goes wrong, you can kind of work backwards and work through your head on exactly how to handle the situation. Kind of like working backwards, reverse engineering, all those fancy words for understand your airplanes. Some turbocharged aircraft have issues with vapor lock. Who's had vapor lock before? Yeah, I've had vapor lock. You'll be fortunate if you get it on the ground, but it can occur in the air. I know, for example, on a Columbia 400, they require the vapor boost pump to be on at altitudes above 18,000 feet. You got to make sure you're operating these airplanes within those limitations. In fact, the ditchings that have all happened over the past, probably last one I know of was in 2008. The last ones, which I'll talk about here, was all due to mechanical failure. No, I mean, not due to mechanical failure, but to pilot error. There's so many. There's been stories about people running out of gas. not checking the fuel in their lines, not following the procedure, or not checking the water for contaminants in their fuel, people not knowing their systems, and they're pretty much self-induced. Understand your cross feed. If you have extra fuel tanks, know how to get to that fuel. Don't wait until that engine quits. Understand the emergency procedures and review them. Your first time running the emergency checklist shouldn't be during the emergency. You should still have a kind of idea on how things are supposed to go and what exactly you're supposed to do. Now, I'm not saying memorize everything, but be familiar with what the procedure is if you were to lose an engine and cross feed and everything like that. And as you can see, you have a little cub, it looks like, trying to struggle to lift something up because they decided to operate it outside the limitations. Another tool for survival. So there's a lot of different people out there who market different products, different types of personal locator beacons. You have your 406 personal ELTs, you have DeLorme, you have spot trackers. I personally use a DeLorme because it allows texting and email capability. I can talk to handlers and maybe even get weather reports and everything like that along the way. But have something there that can give you an accurate description of your location. Accuracy is absolutely key. Earlier today in the seminar about survival, he was talking about, well, if you stop responding and you say a mayday call and you give them coordinates right here, well, that's where the Gulf Stream current is. Where do you think that current's going to carry you, right? You need to be accurate with your location. If you only can give a location within 20 miles, think of how long it's going to take to search those 20 miles. And they've got good tools. I mean, they've got infrared. They really do a great job, especially in these North Atlantic regions, in being able to bring people back. And people do get brought back. But you need to be able to give your location. And the great thing about the DeLorme is that it allows tracking to happen, and it uploads a point every 10 minutes so that rescuers could also get a trajectory, kind of see what you were doing and the capability. And I also make sure to update that every single time I fly with the current color of the airplane as well as the registration, as well as any pertinent medical information like, hey, are you allergic to penicillin, or, O positive blood type. All these different things that can aid people in your rescue. Knowing where you are is pretty much most of the battle. Not just that, but a lot of times your fixes are hundreds of miles away from each other. And if you're only doing position reports every 1 hour, that's a 160-mile search area. So don't just rely on ATC. Even if you're flying domestically, don't just rely on them to always see where you are. Make sure you carry something with you. In fact, when I just go out and flying for fun, I take it with me. It's free insurance. If something does happen, I have a way of getting my location out nearly immediately. And a lot of these are also waterproof and can float as well. But anything you can do to minimize that search area is going to aid in your rescue. Talking about foreign procedures and regulations. Who here has flown in other countries that require an IFR alternate even when the weather's good? There's a few of them out there. So a lot of them have these different rules, and I'm going to talk about strategic alternates in a second. Some countries actually have ceiling requirements to attempt instrument approaches. So here in the U.S., we're used to what? Visibility, right? We need the visibility for the approach, at least in most of the airline world. It always cracks me up because, I've been dispatched to airports that only have an RNAV approach that gets down to 400 feet AGL, and the clouds are calling it 200, but yeah, it's 10-mile visibility, so let's try it, right? But a lot of countries actually have ceiling requirements. Certain airports in Greenland close when the clouds and the ceiling get to a certain level. And that's caught a lot of people off guard, too. They say, oh, it's going to be 10 miles visibility all day. But, hey, they close the airport when it gets down to 1,500 or 1,200. And you got to know these things in advance, otherwise you're going to get violated. Or even worse, you could end up in a fuel emergency situation. Strategic alternates. So under ICAO rules, if you file an alternate in a country, that gives you pretty much permission to land in that country in the event of an emergency or in the event of a missed approach or diversion or anything like that. Some countries, like for example, like Honduras, they require landing permits. Belize, Guatemala are just a few of them that are going to want permission. In fact, in Greenland, a lot of the airliners use those airports as alternates. And if they file that airport as an alternate outside of Greenland business hours, because they work bankers' hours in Greenland, then they actually get charged a $1,500 fee for them to be on standby just for using that airport as an alternate, because it is legal authorization that, hey, I'm going to be coming there. So I know that personally, let's say, for example, I was crossing a Great Lake, right? And I'm going from one place in the U.S. to another place in the U.S. Well, there's Canada in between. I would file an alternate in Canada It doesn't have to be an airport of entry alternate, just a legal IFR alternate. Well, depends on the country. And so if you end up having an engine failure, having to divert, well, now at least they know there's the potential that you could be there. And so I use strategic alternates a lot. And when I'm flying over several countries, I'll put both IFR alternates in there in order to get that kind of protection. Now, you're still going to have to deal with penalties and fees and everything like that, but under ICAO, it's pretty much a safe haven. If you file it as an alternate and you have permission to be in that airspace, then you're completely legal if you have to divert or land. I always say check NOTAMs. How many people check NOTAMs before every single flight? Never got caught off guard by NOTAM. I remember I was on my way up to Oshkosh 2 years ago, and I can't remember the airport that I landed at. And they had a NOTAM that one of the runways was closed, right? And I called in, and I was saying, oh, I'm landing on this road. It was like, wait, you're the first one today that actually read the NOTAM. And they gave me a 10-cent a gallon discount on the gas for reading the NOTAM. They did. They said, you were the first one today that has read that NOTAM and called in that you were using that tiny other little runway because the other one was closed. How many people get caught off guard by NOTAMs all the time? Especially in Europe, a lot of times, fuel availability. I know it's not something we think about a whole lot in the U.S., but if the airport is published as having fuel, and now it doesn't, they have to put a NOTAM out for that. NOTAMs for approaches, NOTAMs for rescue services availability, especially in Europe, because they love NOTAMs in Europe. I mean, you can't find a single airport that has less than 10. It almost reminds me of Atlanta or Detroit. Always tons of NOTAMs. So yeah, make sure you're reading those NOTAMs because that could dramatically change your operation. I remember I was about to launch once to Goose Bay, and I actually had checked the NOTAMs, and then right before I took off, I saw an update that they were out of gas. And we were out in the middle of nowhere. We barely have gas for anywhere else, and I called them up. It's like, yeah, we ran out of gas 5 minutes ago. And sometimes there's a delay in getting that information. So I personally like to call ahead as well and verify avgas availability. I call Kuujjuaq directly and say, how many barrels do you have sitting there outside? Because if the answer is less than 5, you better get on it because they're about to be gone. And a lot of these places up in these really remote areas, it's all ice most of the year. And about once a year, they actually have an icebreaker ship that comes in, and they bring them the fuel that they're going to use for the year. But there's no ports, so they actually bring the ships about like a mile off the coast, and they use helicopters to take stuff over to the city because there's no other way to get it there. There's no port. It's all ice. So making sure that you check NOTAMs and availability is going to keep you from getting caught off guard. So now I'm going to talk about the big thing when it comes down to ferry flying, which is advanced weather. The thing that people ask me the most about. How do you do this? How do you fly airplanes, piston airplanes, across when there's icing conditions? Or, how do you do it in adverse weather? This picture right here was taken. My face pretty much says it all. Yeah, and I'm actually wearing my my cotton pants, too, because I had been wearing a suit. So there I am with my jacket and the tow bar. This was shortly after I landed in La Grande Riviere, which is on the southeast side of the Hudson Bay. And they get a lot of lake effect snow in there. So just, in the wintertime especially, one of the guys told me they have less than 20 clear days a year there. I mean, the weather is bad. I say that the hardest weather the entire way is up through Canada, easily. And so after I landed, it just started pouring snow. So I got to spend the night there in this neat little French village. And the cab driver, I don't think that I ever saw him go under about 90 kilometers an hour on snow-covered roads. It was actually kind of an interesting experience. Not the best overnight, I'm just going to put that out there. We ended up getting stuck there, right? Because a snowstorm came, we had to wait for the weather to clear. So let's talk about icing conditions, and I'll give a little bit of a disclaimer after this. But this was one of the most recently known ditchings where somebody ditched because of icing conditions. And this, a pilot was flying a Cherokee across. From what I know about everything, he had crossing experience before. Waiting in Iceland for a few days, which, as you can see from the dates in the last one, I waited a while because the area that I couldn't find a good weather window to go to was exactly where this happened, actually. About 150 miles southeast. The weather can get real bad there because there's lots of fronts and lots of occluded fronts, especially in the wintertime. And so, called out his location. The helicopters were airborne right as it happened. mean, they were ready. They were airborne almost immediately after the Mayday call, and they still haven't found the airplane to this day. So I always like to tell people in aviation that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. This could have been easily prevented, but icing is a real serious issue, especially in these colder climates. Who here deals with icing conditions where they live? Okay, so you've dealt with it, right? Especially if you live up in the Northeast, or if you fly over the Great Lakes or parts of anywhere north, right? Icing can be an issue. And so this could have been easily preventable, but the airplane ended up icing up. And in the wintertime, it's especially challenging because the freezing levels to the surface. So if you're flying along for most parts of the U.S., a lot of times of the year, well, hey, the freezing level's only at 4,000 feet, you have it out. But when you're doing this in the winter, the freezing level is to the surface. And so if you pick up ice, there is no way to get it off. You have to be right on when it comes down to weather. So this is my disclaimer. Everything I say here is personal technique. If you want to know exactly how to encounter icing, you need to consult your POH or aircraft manufacturer, because this is just general guidance that's been provided by the FAA and different organizations. But every airplane is different. Every airplane has certain procedures. Some of them have minimum speeds and certain things that you do. So if you ever want to know what to do in your particular aircraft, you need to consult the aircraft manufacturer. So the FAA published an advisory circular on icing conditions in general aviation aircraft. It's 9174B. And they have a lot of good guidance in there that kind of is a general understanding of how icing conditions work and exactly how to avoid them. And so, obviously, what do we need for icing? We need liquid water content, visible moisture, right? We need freezing temperatures, and anything can ice up. Who here has experienced icing in their airplane? If you're flying on a jet, you've probably gotten it too, right? So it's not the most comfortable feeling now, is it? Even with a hot wing in a jet, icing, for me, I don't really like it too much. Now, who's here has flown through clouds at freezing that didn't have any ice? That happens all the time, right? But can you tell by looking at them? Not normally, right? It's going to depend on the liquid water content, which is what the advisory circular talks about. And there's no way to look at a cloud and tell how much liquid water content it actually has. Now, there's some indicators that will kind of give you a general idea of how much liquid water content it has, but there's no way to know for sure. And ice accumulation is greatest at temperatures just below freezing with high liquid water content, and the FAA advisory circular says that at negative 20 Celsius and negative 4, it's nearly negligible liquid water content as the clouds are made particularly out of ice particles, which I'll talk about that for a second. So that being said, not all clouds have the same temperatures at every level, right? You got to take other things into account. Like, for example, if you're flying over mountains, right, and you have a lifting process, you can have warm air getting forced up. So just because your thermometer says negative 20 doesn't mean you're not going to go through parts of the cloud that are much warmer than that, which is why fronts can be especially dangerous over the ocean, because they could be bringing warm air with high liquid water content up into those clouds. So that doesn't mean that you're just shooting for that temperature is going to keep you clear of ice, but it's a start, right? But you got to take a look at a lot of different things, such as the composition of the cloud, the overall general weather, which I'll talk about that in a second. Also, just because you have a TKS system doesn't always mean that it's effective all the time. Who here has a TKS or a weeping wing on their airplane or has flown with that before? There's temperature limitations, right? If it's negative 100 out, is your TKS probably going to work? It's probably going to be frozen right where it's at, right? So make sure that if you do have some type of flight and unknown icing system, that you're operating within those limitations as well. So I call it my temperature goal. So in this case, I was looking for a temperature of about negative 25, which is what I have right here. You can see right there, outside air temperature, negative 25. And that's generally what I shoot for, negative 25 to negative 30. You don't really want to get down to negative 40 with a lot of piston engines, especially if they don't have like winter kits or anything like that on them. But once again, you have to consult your aircraft manufacturer, because every engine is different and every O320 is different. There's 3 letters or 4 letters after these engines, and all of them are different. The designs of the carburetor, the designs of the injection system, where are your oil lines, all of these play into account. But generally speaking, the reason that I got up to this altitude was literally for this temperature. And it kept me clear of ice pretty much the entire way across. In fact, look at those winds. I had This was eastbound. I was going southeast. You can see my wind correction heading, and I had 50 knots of wind on the nose going eastbound, which is not that common. Everybody usually has tailwinds going to Europe, but I'm the headwind lady, and I have headwinds every time going to Europe. I can't figure out why. I think it's because, somebody doesn't want me to make money. But yeah, I had headwinds, so I actually had to stop in Kulusuk on the east coast of Greenland and get gas because of these absolutely awful headwinds. I think I had a ground speed of like 120 knots at the time, which is pretty low. And so that was my temperature goal. I shot for about -25. It put me right into controlled airspace right off the east coast of Greenland. It's controlled up to 19,000, or it's uncontrolled up to 19,000. And I went on my way, and it was pretty uneventful. And a lot of times in the U.S., we're not used to clouds being much higher unless it's convective than 15,000 feet. But you never know with frontal systems. You can easily have clouds that are much higher than that, which I'll talk about different tools we can use for that as well.
What were you flying?
This was in a Turbo 206. I was on supplemental oxygen. So these are some different resources, and this will be at the end of the slide as well. It talks about the different resources that I use. I always make the joke that I use like 7 tools for each water leg. And people are like, well, that's a lot. You can't just look at TAFs, or you can't just look at one prognostic chart. I'll show you how I compare everything. But these are just a few of the different tools that I use that are provided by each country, and I have the phone numbers for each. And I'll talk about each of these tools individually. And there'll be a slide here at the end that I'll leave it on, which shows all these different tools. And some of these are paid subscriptions. Most of them are free because I don't like paying money for everything. And so a lot of these tools are actually free. Pilot Brief, WSI Pilot Brief Optima is not free. ForeFlight is not free. Nav Canada is free. Well, they'll make you pay in landing fees and clearances. But free, pretty much everything on here is free. The problem with CNAM is they don't have any English translation, so you'll have to be able to read that in Spanish. They actually now, Mexico allows you to file flight plans online, which is really kind of cool. I was kind of surprised about that. So let's talk about a grommet. Who here has heard of a grommet before? No, not many people have. I wrote an article for Avemco recently about grommets. So a grommet is kind of an interesting tool that people really don't use. It's not that common here in the U.S. And it's a graphical vertical flight path weather forecast based on everything. It compares prognostic charts, airmets, sigmets, winds aloft, and it provides a great graphical representation along a specific flight path at a specific time. And it's actually a great tool that helps me understand where the clouds are and where the icing is. You can put your information in there, get the grommet immediately. Not all North American fixes are in there, but they should have most of the airports and most of the major fixes, as well as they can take GPS coordinates. You can use Augomet if you have an Android. It's a little bit harder to use. I personally use AutoRouter, which is a European tool for this, but I'll show you how that works. So this is an example of a grommet that I pulled up recently. And this kind of shows a lot of different information here. So a grommet gives you your vertical path. So if I go straight from Sandreström to Keflavik, this is exactly what I can encounter. And the magenta line is my path. And you could obviously add fixes in there if you were given a different oceanic clearance. This right here is the Greenland ice cap. And as you can see, there's a little bit of weather right here on the western side of the Greenland ice cap. And if you go online, you'll be able to see a legend. These are generally icing conditions that are right here. And this little green line shows you the freezing level along the way, as well as the predicted cloud locations, and then your weather along the ocean, which is a really good thing to know because that also plays in your decision making. How easy is rescue going to get you when you've got 100-foot ceilings across the entire North Atlantic? Probably not going to be so good for a helicopter, right? And so it also tells you where the winds are in direction to where you're going. So right now, that little path shows me pretty much on a direct east heading, and I have a little bit of a headwind because I can never cross the ocean without a headwind. And so it also tells your temperatures farther up, as well as the location of the tropopause, especially if you're in a higher performance airplane, you can understand that, as well as your temperatures en route. As you can see, this is actually a front here, and I'll show you why. Why do you think that is? There's a lot of clouds and moisture and everything like that. There's something going on there, right? It's not just a beautiful high, and this is what it looks like. Oh, this is another one. This is from my trip across the Gulf. And this right here is going from Sugar Land to Belize City in the air tractor. And you can see these are also some symbols which show the potential for convective activity, which is really cool. And it explains that on the website as well about being able to interpret those. But it says the likelihood of convective cumulonimbus clouds occurring. And you can use this in the U.S. too. So it looks at the atmospheric conditions, and it comes out with a value that tells you how likely it is that thunderstorms are going to form. So, as you can see from the picture 2 before, right? This is in between. Guess what that is? Right there. Because there's Keflavik and there's thunderstorm. So you can see right toward there, that's where your front is, right? And so this right here is a North Avimit prognostic chart. This is based off the United Kingdom Atlantic forecast. And then Canada has their own as well, the flightplanning.nav Canada. And you can kind of be able to compare that. So now the grommet and the prog chart kind of show the same thing. I'll talk about this right here. This is one of the subpolar lows that's occurring right now. And there's usually a low pressure system around there. So the weather's not amazing, right? If you were crossing anywhere, you're going to have to deal with a bunch of fronts as you go across. This right here is another tool that I use. This is called a model data. And this one is, there's 2 different charts here. I don't know if you can see that very easily. But this actually shows me the potential for icing at these different altitudes. So right there in the boxes, that's the freezing level. And the yellow shows the potential for rime icing between 10 and 15,000 feet. And you can kind of look at that. So you compare that then with the precipitation chart. Right here you can see the precipitation, the grommet and the prognostic charts was talking about. And you can compare the two and say, what are my chances of picking up ice there? I also use infrared, right? So that tool, that chart, shows all of that formation right there. I confirm it right here. There's Iceland. And then I look at the infrared. Where is that front actually, right? Because those forecasts only come out in about 12-hour periods. And so what is it doing right now? Because a lot of times the difference between being able to go and not go is literally a few hours. And so what is the weather doing right now? So I use the infrared charts really, really highly. You can kind of see those other 2 fronts we saw on the other chart. And you can take a look at what the other weather is doing right now. And there's ForeFlight has a way to look at the infrared, and you can also do it with, I believe this one was on North Avimit as well, which is more specifically for North Atlantic planning. So I always compare what those charts are doing with what are the clouds actually doing at this moment. And I personally am a big believer in printing out your paperwork. So the great hotel I usually stay at in Iqaluit, they usually print out these charts for me. And so I usually print them out, and I actually do manual plotting of everything because obviously you don't have data, and I'm always worried about cell phones not working and everything like that. So I usually print out the charts for the different altitudes, and then I take a look at it. So as you can see, that low is swirling right here. It confirms everything that we've just seen on all the other charts. So I'm making sure that everything lines up, and then what I do is I make a personal forecast, and I say, okay, based on all the data available to me, what do I think the weather is going to do? Based on the data, based on my experience, based on my knowledge. And that's when you make the go or no-go decision. So as you can see here, I have it right here. I compared all these different tools, as well as the other ones that I showed you, in order to make that decision, right? So depending on the airplane, probably in a normally aspirated bonanza, I'd probably be leaning against it based on this alone. And I might wait till it gets a little bit better, just because there is a potential for icing between 10 and 15,000 feet, and the performance loss at or below 4,000 with the icing level isn't too amazing. So that's what can happen, though. If you're in a normally aspirated airplane, especially in the winter, you can end up waiting a long time, which is what happened in that 210. I ended up leaving Iceland and coming back to get the airplane, which is a lot cheaper because, believe it or not, I only paid $1 a day to leave the plane in Iceland. One day in the big airport, Keflavik, $1 a day. And that was a lot cheaper than ending up at the bottom of the ocean. And so sometimes you just have to wait it out, right? Now, if you're in a turbojet or something like that, not a big issue. If you've got good known icing protection, not a big deal. But it's all based on your equipment, right? If I'm in a Aero Commander, I'd probably go. If I'm in a Cessna 172, probably not. Right? So it's all based on what you're flying, the equipment capabilities, what is your performance log that you've done so far, what does it say? Can you get up there? What's your speed at its top altitude? Well, do you have enough oxygen for that? All those different things play into it. So let's talk about microclimates and major weather systems. So this is probably more information that you need to know, but they have something called the North Atlantic Oscillation, and it kind of explains the weather, kind of like the El Nino, La Nina, and everything like that. Depending on what cycle you're in, it's because I seem to always get it when I get the headwinds going east. But yeah, so it's kind of responsible for that. So they call it the subpolar low. It usually lies between Greenland and Iceland. It almost looks like a hurricane from above. It always kind of swirls there. And it's going to be at some location. The subpolar low is going to be at some location along that route, along the North Atlantic. If you've ever looked out the window and seen the bands of it, it's actually kind of cool looking. So let's talk about microclimates. Who here lives in a place that has a microclimate? And people always ask me, well, is Iceland full of ice? And I said, well, actually, it's quite the opposite, right? Iceland, there's parts of Iceland. You go up into, I can never pronounce this right, Elstadr. That's up on the northeast side of Iceland. And it's nearly in the Arctic Circle. But it's not freezing cold like it is in Greenland and Russia. And why is that? Because you have other environmental factors. You know, for example, Los Angeles. Why is it that on the other side of the valley it's always so hot, but it's always so nice in Los Angeles? So all these different things play into that. There's a microclimate there. Iceland, you get warm water, the Gulf Stream, that comes up there and it warms a lot of these countries. So a lot of parts of Europe are actually further north than parts of the Hudson Bay. But why is it so cold here, but not here? It's all because of a microclimate. So depending on the currents, depending on the geography, depending on the climate, even though you're at a really, really high latitude, you might actually have springtime weather year-round. Or, you know, there's some places around the, you know, some islands that you would think would be warm and they're cold all the time. So that's one thing to take into consideration if you're flying all these different places, that sometimes the weather of a particular destination is not like the weather of its surrounding areas because of different geography features. Like there's several airports in Greenland that have generally better weather, even though the airport that's, you know, 100, 200 miles away is always bad. Right? So depending on geography and everything like that, you can look at that. And I even included the average temperatures. So Reykjavik it's an island in the North Atlantic. Look how far north it is. But look at the temperatures. A low of 29 degrees. It's barely freezing there in winter, whereas its counterparts over here are negative 40 every day. Right? So it's all based on these different climate features and everything like that. So this is what I can say, too. Make your own forecast. How many times has the weatherman been wrong? How many times has the TAF been wrong? Oh, the snow's not supposed to get here till tomorrow. The biggest lie is in aviation, right? The snow's not going to get here till tomorrow. There's not going to be fog tonight. You know, anything like that, right? Make your own forecast. Talk to the locals. I get so much information by talking to the Greenland Met Office, because they live there. They know exactly what's going to go on. And they do a pretty good job at forecast, but I hate to say it, I haven't really seen a very accurate forecast in Greenland. There's been some that have come pretty close, but for the most part, the weather changes in some of these places so often that it's really hard to get a good forecast. Make your own forecast. Call the locals. Call somebody at the FBO. I've done that all the time. Hey, I'm calling somebody. Hey, I'm thinking about coming in. What does the weather look like? What's your opinion of it? Use that as an additional tool, because the people that live there are going to know the weather. You ever had a pilot call you and say, what's it doing? And you kind of give them a good idea of it, because you know you've lived there. You understand the weather. And once again, I have all the references, so you guys can take a picture of this one if you'd like. It also has the FAA advisory circular, if you want to take a picture of that. So in conclusion, it's safe to fly an airplane across the ocean, right? Everything in life takes risk. If you're going to do some of these things, you've got to come up with a good mitigation strategy. Knowledge is power. Having an understanding of what you're doing. If you know your airplane, you know your weather, and you make good decisions, there is nothing unsafe about doing this at all. Of course, you always have that 0.001% chance that something could go wrong that's completely not known. But if you do your job and you take care of the things that need to be taken care of, the chances of this happening are fairly low. Something bad happening are fairly low. And so just because you fly a 152 doesn't mean you can't take it 2,000 miles. Just because you fly a 172 doesn't mean you can't take it across the ocean. It can all be done, but it's all about what's on your head. I tell people that ferry flying is so little about stick and rudder skills. I got to go 2,000 miles across the country. I get to pick my days. I get to pick my airports. I can literally pick every airport with into the wind. Most of my ferry flights on all these different airplanes I've flown before, I never fly with more than a 5-knot crosswind, and I can do that because I can pick those plays, right? And so it's not about stick and rudder schools, it's about decision-making, the decision-making process. That ditching that I just talked about, the guy who was in the 310 that had happened a few days before that, ditched because of fuel exhaustion. All of these things happen because of decision-making. If you got a good head on your shoulders, there's really nothing you can't do in aviation. Know your airplane, know your limitations, know your weather, ask for help when needed, use all available resources, check your NOTAMs, take care of your airplane, and you're going to have a great and long career in aviation and the ability to do all kinds of cool things that you never thought you'd be able to do. So I thank you for coming today, and I'm open to any questions if you have them.
Stand by for the mic.
Okay. He asked what type of survival suit that I prefer. And so there's certain ones that are better than others, and you can actually look on them. I personally use a Stearns brand survival suit, which is a kind of a dry suit. And it does have the hands, and it zips up with the hood on the top, as well as a flotation in the back. I personally use that suit. They're highly uncomfortable. I'm sure that there's something out there that's better, but that's what I personally use. But obviously, it's going to depend on your operation. If you're flying, you're going to wear a different suit over the North Atlantic than you would over the Gulf. So obviously, look at what it's rated for, as well as your exposure times and everything like that, depending on the temperature of the water. Go ahead.
Have you ever ditched?
Negative. I think in some of these routes, if I had ditched, I don't quite know if I'd be here, but you take all the equipment with you, and there are people who've been brought back. There's been impossible survival stories. I know somebody who ditched a Bonanza in the winter off the coast of Canada and came back alive.
You want to ask the question? Here you go.
Was it Jerry? I know that Steve Rayner was with him.
Out of Bangor, Maine?
Yes.
He took my 172 across.
Really? Yeah, he was a well-known ferry pilot.
He told me the story of ditching at a restaurant off of Rush Street, Chicago. And the fact that he was there to tell me the story, of course, was thank God for it, Jim.
Yeah, it's
Harrowing story. Harrowing story.
Yeah, it would be a pretty harrowing story if you did have to ditch. But no, I have not ditched an airplane before.
Okay, we got a question up here.
Okay.
I'm just curious about fuel modifications, and do you have a preferred provider to maybe modify a small, Cherokee or Cessna to carry enough fuel for this kind of, mission?
Yeah, there's a few different options you have if you want to install auxiliary tanks. I generally don't do them. Air tractors come from the factory with the fittings to be able to do it from hopper fuel. Now, there's a few different places that you can use, but for the most part, you can either do it one of two ways. You can either go with an STC, something that's already been designed and approved for that airplane, or you can go field approval. So what you can do is you'll have to set up your own system, design it, present that paperwork to your DAR or the FSDO, and then they'll decide whether or not to approve it, and then you have to get your special flight permits, notify the appropriate agency. So it's kind of an involved process. I'm able to avoid doing that in a lot of these routes by making extra stops. If you don't go with auxiliary fuel, your longest leg across is 487 miles. You can reduce that by calling Sismute in advance. About 6 months, they can get a barrel of avgas for you. I believe that cuts it down to closer to 400 miles. It was what the range you would need.
Do you bring your own food?
Yes, we do bring our own food. A lot of these airports do not have that. Make sure you declare it in Canada. Don't go into Canada with an apple that you didn't declare. That's one thing you're going to learn from this seminar. Always declare your fruit. But yes, we generally bring our own food with us, and we mix it up to make sure we have a good level of electrolytes and and nutrition because you're on oxygen and everything like that. So,
what's the scariest thing you've ever had happen to you?
Oh, should I admit to it? That's the question. I've had ice bridging before. That's pretty scary. I know people say it's a myth and it's not going to happen, and I waited until I had over an inch of ice to blow the boots, and the ice bridged and continued accumulating. That's pretty scary. And I had Brutes approved. They worked fine, everything like that, but I did have ice bridging. So it can happen. Boots, and boots are effective. You know, some of the smaller piston airplanes, they run off vacuum pumps, right? When you start getting into like heated wings, that's when it gets a lot more safe, or bleed air that power the boots. But yeah, for some of these smaller airplanes that do have boots, you got to be careful. Make sure that you're treating the boots appropriately and everything like that. But ice bridging is possible.
Just a second, I'll come with the mic.
Hello. Yeah, I just wanted to ask, how did you break into the business? Somebody must have taught you how to do this. You were mentored by someone?
Yes, I've had several pilots that are in the industry, great people. I've got one of my mentors, his name is Mike. He has a lot of crossing experience. He kind of helped me out. My first time crossing was in a King Air with somebody who had done it before, and he was looking for somebody to go with him. I was always really good at paperwork. That's always been my forte throughout life. I mean, if you need, paperwork done, I'm really good at it. So I offered to go along as a co-pilot and handle the customs portion of it in exchange for getting the experience. And so the first time I went with somebody who had already done it before, and that's kind of how I got broken into the industry.